Hello class and welcome to Political Geography Week. So this is Unit 4 of our class. It's our second to last topic. That's eligible content for the AP exam. And I wanted to talk a bit about the global urban system, the global system of cities, to make some connections between some of the content in the urban unit that we didn't really get to learn about and make some connections to political geography. And this is stuff that could be on the exam. I don't know if it will be, but I think it's going to help us make some great connections across some of the units. So first, if I also posted a chart that's going to go along with this. So it's an Excel spreadsheet. It says World City Chart. So if you want to just grab that and have it open, we're going to use it. If you want to mark the X's along with this as I go through it, great. Probably would be a little easier if you print it out, but you could very easily, put the video and this into two different windows if you did something like this, right, where you get a side-by-side situation going on. But anyway, we're going to use this as part of the lesson today, kind of talk about the global hierarchy in the world, urban hierarchy. So anyway, if we take a look at this, this is the largest cities in the world as of 1950. And if you take a look at that, just make some observations about locations, things you notice, size, those sorts of things. And you probably recognize that most of the world's largest cities in 1950 were in Western cities, right? Either in Europe or the United States. And then some of the other cities that were very large, Tokyo, Japan, China. China has always been a huge population cluster in the world, so that makes a lot of sense. Argentina starting to grow, a large city in 1950, but again, it was a population cluster to begin with. We're going to fast forward here to 2015 and take a look at how these things have changed. First of all, the sheer size of cities on this list compared to the list before. New York at 12.3 million was the largest city in 1950. We got Tokyo, Japan at nearly 30. Think about what might account for that change. If you said the demographic transition, absolutely. If you mentioned urbanization trends due to demographic transition and economic development and economic changes, that would be true as well. And again, you notice where are the locations of most of these cities now. Only one of them is in the west, right? And only two are in what we would consider the global core. The rest are in the the semi-periphery and the periphery of those countries that are going through the middle stages of demographic transition. These countries that are in stage 3 are entering stage 4 of the demographic transition, and they're all growing very rapidly. City size, however, is not necessarily an indicator of its political power in a place or in the world. Now, it's certainly, the number of people is going to play a role, but when we look at the global scale, just simply having a lot of people doesn't necessarily mean that a city is going to be dominant. And so in a previous lecture, we talked about services in the central business district and why people want to move to cities in the first place. They want to move there because they want to have access to services. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you through the locations of the headquarters of major industries in the global economic system. And we're going to make some notes about where these services are located to identify our world cities, the cities that have the greatest concentration of services, because that's going to translate into global influence, both economically and politically. Okay, so again, these are our largest cities in the world in terms of people, in terms of population, and that has weight, that is important. But we're also going to take a look at the services that go along with that. So I'm going to go on through here. And so, the directions are, if you're going to use that chart, you're going to put an X in there or make a note. If you just want to follow along with me and kind of notice some repetition, I think you'll notice the cities that repeat frequently. So, headquarters for banking in the financial industry. I don't think it's any surprise here that London, New York, and Tokyo, then Hong Kong and Singapore. Why? It goes back to colonial trade, right? Think about the British Empire, think about the French Empire, and the importance that those places played in those global trade routes during the era of colonialism. Producer services. These are services that get things done. They manage projects. They get you money to get things made, right? So there's our makers. Management. These are headquarters of managing large corporations, where you're most likely to find headquarters of things. Concentration of law services, where you're going to most likely find the biggest law firms in the world. You got insurance. So the insurance headquarters, companies like AIG, one of the world's largest insurance companies. Advertising services. People want to sell you stuff. Producers of media. So this would be music, movies, commercials. No surprise there. LA, right? Milan, Italy. People don't think about that as a media influencer, but they are. Architecture and engineering. United Nations agencies. These are agencies that are related to those different branches of the United Nations, whether it be the Security Council or security, those sorts of things. Brussels. There's a lot of them. Geneva. Humanitarian and environmental non-governmental organizations. These are departments or agencies or companies that focus on humanitarian aid or environmental improvement. Scientific research. Very busy right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then national diplomatic missions. I think this one is really, really telling as to which cities, and then therefore which countries have influence on the global stage. These are the cities where you're most likely to find the most foreign diplomatic embassies. So Washington, D.C. has the most, and then New York has second most because of the United Nations. The headquarters is there. And then followed by London, Tokyo, Paris. So, these are places, they're countries and they're cities where foreign governments want to have a person to have a voice and to have interaction, to have connection with these places. And so we go through that list and you take a look at the chart, and if you were doing the X's, you probably made some observations about which places have these total X's here. And the ones with the most X's are going to be our global cities. But then you notice that there's also some that have a few and then some that have a few less, right? And so we kind of have this hierarchy or this tiered system of world cities. And this is what it looks like. So we have our top tier global cities, London, New York, and Tokyo. They had the most X's, they have the most services. They have the most influence in the world. And makes a lot of sense because the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan are part of that core, that economic and political core around the country. And they act as control centers for the global economy. They are critical decision makers. And they are producers of global culture. We think about things that get diffused around the world. Many of them start in these places. Or become popular in these places. Then we have our second tier of cities that have, that still have a lot of influence, but maybe not as much as our alphas of our top tiers. Places like Paris and Chicago, Sao Paulo, Zurich. Those are influential places. And then we have our third tier cities as well, who maybe are centers for one or two of these things, like Hong Kong and finance, or Milan for fashion and media. So they might not be able to influence the world as much culturally or economically, politically as London, New York, or Tokyo, but they still have this great influence. So understanding these countries and how they act in terms of the global hierarchy is important for understanding the political hierarchy as well. So, we mentioned that they can influence other people. They're producers of culture, and then therefore they're also producers of decisions about what kind of culture gets accepted or rejected. If you want to use Milan as an example for fashion, right? What's going to be popular in fashion and what's not going to be. Brussels is the headquarters of the EU, so they have a political function there. What's going to happen with the EU in terms of decision making for those European countries? But notice these countries aren't all on the list of most populated countries today. In fact, many of those countries that were on our list aren't in even the third class of world cities. And so population doesn't necessarily always translate into the political power or the economic power that some of these other world cities have. It also helps us understand the difference sort of at a different scale. So it's kind of global scale, but if we look at the country scale, we start to see a hierarchy of cities emerge as well. And countries tend to follow one of two sort of rules. Now, again, these are models, they're not always perfect. We have the rank size rule and the primate city rule. Primate city, I think, is very easy to understand. It's just the largest city. It's very dominant. And they're so much bigger than the next city that they sort of outrank everyone. So there isn't any really hierarchy. So for example, there's London, and there's everywhere else in the UK. In France, there's Paris, and then there's everywhere else. In Korea, there's Seoul, and there's everywhere else. Versus the rank size rule, where you have a large city, and then the next largest city or next largest cities are one-nth the size of that. So, for example, the second largest city is about half the size of the largest city. The third largest city is about a third of the size of the largest city. Fourth largest is about a fourth, and so on and so forth. And we can kind of see this laid out on a map here, where we have our global hierarchy: New York, London, Tokyo as our dominant world cities, and then we also have our major world cities: L.A., Chicago, Paris, Milan, Singapore, and then our secondary world cities, sort of our third class, like Seoul, Hong Kong, Mexico City. And what's interesting is that if we kind of take a look at that in terms of whether they're primate cities or rank size rule, we can also see that also relates to the type of government that a place has. So, for example, the UK we know is a unitary system, right? They have a centralized government that sort of gives power locally, right? They have devolved somewhat, but they're still very centralized in that central parliament and that prime minister into actual decision making for the whole country. And then we can also look at Paris, for example, in France. France is a unitary system as well, and Paris acts as the political, cultural, economic core of France. And Paris is a dominant city. It is a primate city. Tokyo in Japan fits that role. Mexico City fits that mold as well. They are primate cities, and many countries with unitary systems tend to have a primate city. One city that is very dominant in terms of population, in terms of political power, in terms of economic power, and at the country scale, they really dominate. In contrast to that, we have countries that may follow a rank size rule. And many of these countries that follow a rank size rule tend to be federal systems. Now, there are exceptions. Mexico is a federal system. They have a primate city. Brazil is a federal system. They don't exactly follow the rank size rule perfectly. But the rank size rule, if we want to look at sort of a good example of it, the United States is that. So, the largest city in the United States is New York, and it's a global dominant city. But then our next largest cities are Los Angeles and Chicago, and they are about half the size, population-wise, of New York. And then as we go down to our secondary world cities in like San Francisco, Miami, Houston, Washington, D.C., they're about a third of the size of New York. And Philadelphia is about the third of the size of New York. And we go down a little bit further, we get places like Kansas City and Minneapolis and Seattle and Portland, and they start to become, a fourth of the size of New York or a fifth of the size of New York. And there's kind of this sort of linear reduction in size as a country, as a city, smaller in population, but then also smaller in influence, right? But it doesn't mean they don't necessarily have any influence at all. So, we have cities that operate globally, right? Our global centers of trade and power. But then, at the country scale, we might go to the regional scale. There might be cities that are really important regionally in a place. And for example, Salt Lake City is really important regionally in this area. It's becoming a tech hub for the world. There's lots of tech companies moving there, and it's a population cluster. And there's not really much else out here in the Midwest. Denver is becoming very, very, very influential in this regional area. And of course, Philadelphia, where we live. We're kind of in between. We're in this megalopolis here. We're in between New York and D.C., which are global cities. But Philadelphia plays an important regional role for this area here of millions of people. It is that urban economic core. And for Pennsylvania, it acts as a political core. It's the largest population cluster in Pennsylvania. So it has huge influence on state politics, even though it represents, from a square mile standpoint, a very small actual physical space in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, in terms of population-wise, covers as much area as the middle part of the state here. So, it's urbanized, and Philadelphia suburbs are very influential in that sort of functional specialization, how they function as a regional hub. So kind of putting this all together and making some connections. Last year, this is one of the FRQ questions. I like to bring it up. I want to bring it up, point out to you, because I just want to show you how the College Board can take ideas from different units and put them together and make you make connections between things. And I think this question is a fantastic example of that. So we're presented with areas of potential devolution, right? And we talked about devolution as a process where centralized governments may give regional or local control to try to prevent a splintering of the state. There's some sort of centrifugal forces within the state that may cause it to break up. And so devolution is a way where you can sort of hopefully prevent that. So here you have to define what devolution is, and then we have to understand how the devolutionary forces, or what devolutionary forces are present within this country. But it's also helpful to understand sort of the urban landscape here and understand some things about cities and their importance and their role. So if we take a look at Spain, for example, Madrid is the federal capital. It's the largest city in terms of politics. But over here in Catalonia, there's also another large city in Spain. That's Barcelona. And Barcelona is the industrial manufacturing core of Spain. And so here in this case, Spain has their capital city, which is the political core, and they have their manufacturing city, which is the economic core in Barcelona. And they've given some regional authority to that part of the country to hopefully keep them happy and prevent them from breaking away. We know that Catalonians have language differences, right? And there's also some economic differences, and they believe that they could be independent from the rest of Spain. So Spain, has a parliament in Catalonia. They get to make some of their local laws, but Madrid, as sort of the political power center of the state, retains that political power and is a federal system, so it has power over that. We kind of take a look at Nigeria as well. Nigeria has, their capital of Abuja here is in the center of the state, and they have also devolved local powers to different regions. Region up here in black and the dots and the lines, whatever. But we have to understand that this is sort of a manufactured capital. It is a forward capital, as we actually call it in geography. Very much like Washington, D.C. or Brasilia. these are forward capitals. It's not the largest city in Nigeria. It's not the economic hub of Nigeria. That's actually here in Lagos. Um, but in order to prevent the river delta area from becoming the economic, political, and cultural core and dominating the rest of Nigeria, um, they moved the capital to the center and devolved the area and gave these people some local autonomy. And so, this city has political power in Nigeria, but the economic power really lies in Lagos. And then the cultural is kind of divided up in different regions. So I think understanding this concept of cities and world cities and how cities interact and what kind of things make these cities important. Is it just population, or are they population centers because they're political centers and they are economic centers and they're cultural centers? When you look at the global scale or the country scale or the regional scale, how are cities interacting with each other? And I think you should have a couple of examples in your head to understand, even if it is United States. But you should also have an understanding of some of our global cities as well, because it may come up in FRQs like this, and it could help you understand how to make connections between some of these other things like devolutionary forces and cultural forces that lead to devolution, centrifugal forces and centripetal forces uniting and dividing, and how those connections are made. So hopefully this makes some sense to you. If you have questions, you can leave a comment for me, or you can see me in office hours now about this. But this week, again, talking about political geography, political review, and how that fits in on different scales. See you in the next lesson.